The government has begun to assess the damage caused by Hurricane Beryl. It says it could be days before the country knows the cost of damage to infrastructure, agriculture, and other crucial sectors. Now, the government says once that has been determined, it has access to funds to speed up the recovery process. To put things in perspective for us, we're now joined by the Finance Minister, Dr. Nigel Clarke. Good evening, Dr. Clarke. Thanks for joining us. First, you said there are a series of, you call them instruments. We like to think of insurance as one product, but you say instruments because there are a range of different products. What are some of them?
Yeah, so we have a suite of financial instruments to provide resources in the event of natural disaster. We have our contingency fund. We have a natural disaster fund. We have a credit contingent claim with the IDB as the third layer. The fourth layer, we have a Caribbean catastrophe reinsurance facility with two insurance products, a tropical cyclone and an excess rainfall product. And then the final layer is a catastrophe bond, which protects us against emergency costs for high intensity direct hits by hurricanes.
Is any of these at all loaned, for instance?
The only one that's loaned is represents potential loans with the credit contingent claim from the IDB.
Okay, understood. So different kinds of funds for different purposes, depending on the nature or extent or intensity of the hurricane or natural disaster that we're facing. In particular, there was a meeting today with regard to one of those funds. Tell us what that meeting was about and how much money we could potentially access.
Right. So the idea is that with this suite of instruments, not all instruments will trigger for all storms, but we want to be in a position where at least some instruments trigger for every storm. Right? Today we got news that the preliminary assessment is that our tropical cyclone insurance with the Caribbean catastrophe reinsurance facility has triggered. And that should deliver a couple of $2 billion to Jamaica. It has to be validated and verified. That will happen next week. But that's very good news on top of the funds that are available in our natural disaster and contingency funds.
No, you say validated and verified. In the case of a hurricane or in the case of a storm, what does that mean exactly?
So this is parametric insurance, a big word, meaning that it's based on a model. And the people at CCRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Reinsurance Facility based in St. Lucia, they have run the models and they have confirmed that the insurance product has triggered. They have to send it for validation to a validator in another country just to make sure their calculations are correct. But the preliminary assessment is that it has triggered and that it would be in the order of just over $2.5 billion if the validation proves correct.
In terms of all of the instruments, what's the overall coverage?
Well, in terms of coverage, we have a lot of coverage. The idea that what we have practiced is a policy where we plan in advance for natural disaster. We finance the cost of recovery of emergency intervention in natural disaster beforehand, so we're not scrambling after. As Minister of Finance and Public Service, I have no need to scramble for funds for an emergency response because we have planned this in advance. In terms of all that is potentially available for the worst possible hit of a hurricane, which Beryl was not, we have our credit contingent facilities, $4.5 billion. We have the credit contingent claim with the IDB, which could be as high as $46 billion. We have the policies with the CCRIF, which are just under $20 billion. And then we have the catastrophe bond, which is $23 billion. And right now we have a precautionary liquidity line with the IMF, which could provide us up to $140 billion. Now, we will not need that, thank God. And because Beryl was not a direct hit, it was significant in parts of the country, but it did not make landfall over Jamaica, and the intensity by the time it reached us was significantly less intense than it was over the Caribbean. So thankfully, that's good news, and it means that some of the higher layer instruments will not trigger.
No, one understands insurance or instruments of this nature are necessary, but it's also important contextually for people to understand that there's work they have to do as well, especially in the context of climate change where there are going to be so many more intense hurricanes. What can Jamaicans do to offset what the government is doing at an individual level? What
You're
can I do?
absolutely right. We have to exercise great personal responsibility. One of the things that we must do is to keep drains and gullies clear. We have examples of persons throwing freshly cut branches from mango trees and ackee trees into a gully, and the water backs up and the water overflows with such force that it tears walls down and it ruins households, and in some cases, causes injury to life. So exercising personal responsibility to not throw into gullies and drains big items that ought to go to the dump.
All right, thank you so much, Minister of Finance, Dr. Nigel Clark, for sharing information in relation to this. And we will, of course, have more on this story and on the insurance coverage, but the coverage of instruments, but overall just the recovery effort as Primetime News continues now.